So we're now finished the sugya here as we start the Mishnah Nun Aleph Amid Beis, the previous sugya of three logim of shemen that are required for the Minchas Chavitim. And now we go back to another issue with regard to Minchas Chavitim, and that is if the Kohen Gadol brought the half of an Isaron in the morning and then he died. So we discussed in the previous Mishnah, what if he was replaced by another Kohen Gadol in the afternoon? And now the Mishnah wants to address the situation in which there was no replacement Kohen Gadol. Lo minu Kohen Gadol acher is Mishel mihaisa kreva. Now we know that the ingredients of a Minchas Chavitim have to come from the private possession of the Kohen Gadol, but now the Kohen Gadol is gone. I mean, you could argue that maybe his heirs should be the ones to bring the Minchas Chavitim from Beso, from their own private stock, as long as the Kohen Gadol wasn't replaced. But let's leave out the Yorshim for a minute. You know, why do they have to step into the shoes of their father? I mean, there are dinim of Yerusha, but not necessarily with regard to the Minchas Chavitim. And Rabbi Shimon Omer Mishal Tzibur. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon comes to the conclusion that it's not going to be brought from the private property of the Yorshim of the Kohen Gadol who died, but rather it should come Mishal Tzibur. In other words, to go to the Trumas Halishka and the public funds that were collected through the Machzah Shekel, and will come up with the other half of the Saran that we need for the Minchas Chavitim in the afternoon. So it means, which is interesting, and this has nothing to do with the Machlok Shin of Shimon Rabbi Yehuda, but it means that there is a Minchas Chavitim that has to be brought independent of the Kohen Gadol. You know, we kept saying on Omen Aleph that the Minchas Chavitim is a chiyuv of a yachid, meaning it's a private responsibility and obligation of the Kohen Gadol, but now the Kohen Gadol is gone, and we haven't replaced them. But nevertheless, we have to bring the Minchas Chavitim. And Rabbi Yehuda Rishal Yorshim, Rabbi Yehuda says that the mammon of the deceased Kohen Gadol is still, so to speak, in the possession of the Kohen Gadol, even though he's gone, vicariously through the Yorshim. Ushlema Haisa Kreva. Now let's keep in mind that we had a drasha from which we derived the conclusion that the entire volume of the Minchas Chavitim that has to be split into two has to first be designated, and we have to bring that entire volume, and that's a whole Isaron, a complete Isaron. Then we're going to divide it up into two halves. Fine. Tan Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa, and now we're going to try to understand this Machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. And first, we're going to start with the understanding of Rabbi Yehuda that the Yorshim of the deceased Kohen Gadol will have to bring the Minchas Chavitim. Kohen Gadol shemeis v'lo minu Kohen acher tachto minayin shetei Minchas ukrev mishal Yorshim. From whence did Rabbi Yehuda derive his conclusion that the private ownership of the Yorshim of the first Kohen Gadol those funds have to be brought for the Minchas Chavitim. Talmud Lomar, it says, "V'hakohen HaMashiach tachtov mibanav yaseh osa." Okay, we have to emphasize the word osa. Now, the word tachtov would seem to indicate that we're talking about the Yorshim. Tachtov literally translates as the replacement, or, yeah, I guess that's a good word, the replacement. So now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, we're going to derive the replacement, meaning the Yorshim. Yochel yakrivenu chatzoin. Then we go back to the whole discussion about whether you can bring half of an Isaron. Right? The Kohen Gadol, when he was alive, he would bring a Chatzi Isaron in the morning, a Chatzi Isaron in the afternoon, but now he's gone. Is Talmud Lomar osa. Now we get back to that extra word osa. And that's going to teach you kula. Osa means the entire Isara. V'lo chetzi, and we don't bring half. Even though, again, the Kohen Gadol during his lifetime brought half of an isaron in the morning for his minchas chavitim, but nevertheless we need kula. That's osa according to Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon is not going to receive the funds for the minchas chavitim from the Yorshim, but rather mishal tzibur, because the pasuk says chok olam. Again, we have to see how Rabbi Yehuda is going to interpret michok olam. And what does chok olam mean? Mishel olam, from the community, meaning from the tzibur. Then the Brisa says, it also says in this pasuk, kolil taktar, which means that it's entirely burnt on the mizbeach. Shetei kula v'aktar. Fine. Now, what's Rabbi Yehuda going to do with the pasuk of chak olam? But first, we have to go back to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says tachtov, and therefore he derives that the Yorshin. But it also says in the pasuk about Kohen Mashiach. The Yoshim cannot be described as Kohen Mashiach. So how can you say that Kohen Mashiach Tachtov is referring to the Yoshim? Why Kohen Mashiach Lahaki Diyasa? And in fact, the phrase here in the Torah Kohen Mashiach comes for an entirely different purpose. For we need it for the Brisa Ze'ah. Now, back at the time of Aaron HaKohen, it was Aaron Ubanov. And the question is, should the Chavitim be brought by both Aaron Ubanov as sort of like a joint partnership? And we say that Zeh Korban, it says in the Pasuk, Zeh Korban Aaron Ubanov, Asher Yakrivu Hashem Biyomi Mashach Oso. So it sounds like the Torah is requiring a shutfis between Aaron Ubanov in the mincha offering of Biyom. Now, keep in mind, it says Biyom hi mashach oso. There is a double chiyuv of minchas chavitim on the Kohen Gadol. Number one, we need the minchas chavitim as the machanech. Remember the word chinuch, the inauguration. To inaugurate the Kohen Gadol on the very first opportunity, he's got to bring a minchas chavitim. That's called biyom hi mashach oso, on the day that they poured the shemin hamishcha on his head and appointed him as Kohen Gadol. But in addition, we have another chiyuv of minchas chavitim imposed on the Kohen Gadol. That's a daily, twice daily chiyuv. In any event, yachol yiyu Aaron ubanim akrivim korban echad. Now, not only does the Kohen Gadol need a minchas chavitim on the day that he's anointed and appointed, but every Kohen needs one time in his lifetime a minchas chavitim to be machanech him as a Kohen. And that's the inauguration of a Kohen who's a Kohen Hedjod, he's not a Kohen Gadol. And the Banav of Bnei Aaron, on that day, B'yom Himashachos, so when there was a Mashiach of Aaron HaKohen as the Kohen Gadol, the Banim have to bring the same Minchas Chavitin for their own Chinuch, their own inauguration as Kohanim, albeit not Kohanim Gedolim. And therefore I might think that when Aaron brings his Minchas Chavitim for his inauguration, and at the same time, the Bnei Aaron have to bring a Minchas Chavitim for their inauguration, maybe it's a partnership deal. Because the Pasuk says, Karban Aaron Ubanab. So maybe it's one carbon for both. Talmud Lomar, but the Pasuk says, Asher Yakrivu Lashem. Now, what do we see in the words Asher Yakrivu Lashem? Perhaps he's going to explain that. Okay, all I got, apparently, this was not posted in the time of the Rishonim, but the Ravid says that Asher Yakrivu Hashem is totally superfluous. So what's the Asher Yakrivu mean? Yakrivu and Yakrivu, meaning Aaron bifnei atzmo, ubanov bifnei atzmo. So even though they're all bringing this for the same goal, Aaron for the inauguration is Kohen Gadol, and Banov for the inauguration is Kohenim Hedyotim, but nevertheless they each have to bring a separate minchas chavit. Now we go on in the pasuk. The pasuk says Banov. Okay, good. This we already had. Banov is Elu Kohenim Hedyotos. So it teaches me that Banov of Aaron needed a minchas chavitim for their inauguration as what? As Kohenim Hedyotos. And therefore, for all posterity, the Kohen, any Kohen, when he has his inauguration to first serve as a Kohen, he needs to bring a minchas chavitim. Ata Omer Kohanim Hadyoto, so Eina El Kohanim Gedolim. Maybe the pasuk is not even referring to a Kohen Hedjot, but only to a Kohen Gadol. He's the only one who brings a minchas chavitim as an inauguration. And the answer is Kshu Omer VaKohen HaMashiach Tatov Mi Banav. So you have at the beginning of the pasuk, you have Kohen Mashiach, which is referring to the Kohen Gadol. Hare Kohen Gadol Amur. And then it says Banav. So why introduce Banav? I mean, you've already told me Kohen Mashiach, meaning the Kohen Gadol. In any event, we see clearly that this brisa derives from the pasuk of Kohen Mashiach Tachto Mi Banav, the halacha that Kohenim Gedolim always have to bring a minchas chavitim. And therefore, how could Rabbi Yehuda use that very same pasuk to derive the conclusion that the Yarshim, in event that their father, the Kohen Gadol, passed on, they have to bring and pay from their own pocket for the chavitim? And the Gemara is going to now answer that according to Rabbi Yehuda, you could derive two things from the same pasuk, which is classic. In Kain Lichtov Kra, if the pasuk is only coming to teach you the halacha that the Kohen Gadol has to bring a minchas chavitim, and the Kohen Hedjot likewise has to bring a minchas chavitim, both for the inauguration, is lichtov kra hakohen Mashiach tachtov banov yaaseh. We're going to add the word yaaseh. Just 1 second. I'm sorry. My mistake. The emphasis here is on the mem of mi banav. The mem of mi banav is superfluous, says Rabbi Yehuda. It could have said banav. And if it would have said banav, then we would only derive the conclusion as far as the Kohen Gadol is concerned. But my mi banav, from the mem of mi banav, shamet minei tarta, you could derive two halachas. So what are the two halachas that we're deriving here from this very same pasuk according to Rabbi Yehuda? Number one, a Kohen Hedjot has to bring a minchas chavitim on the day of his inauguration, the first time he serves in the Mikdash. And a Kohen Gadol, number two, has to bring a minchas chavitim every day that he serves as a Kohen Gadol. So that means, besides the minchas chavitim that the Kohen Gadol, like any Kohen, has to bring as on the day of his inauguration as Kohen Gadol, which is a one-time chavitim, he's got to bring a daily minchas chavitim. So it comes out here that if a Kohen Gadol was anointed and he had never served even as a Kohen, he would need 3 minchas chavitims. He would need a minchas chavitim as any other Kohen would require in the day of his inauguration. He needs a Minchas Chavitim as the Kohen Gadol because it's the day that he is inaugurated. And he needs a Minchas Chavitim of a Kohen Gadol on a daily basis. So this is going to require him another Minchas Chavitim. He needs 3 Minchas Chavitims. Now, what do we do with Reb Shimon? Reb Shimon, Hai Osa my Ovidle, right? What does he do with the word Osa? Because according to Rabbi Shimon, the fact that the Minchas Chavitim, in the case of the Kohen Gadol, died comes from the tzibur, and they have to bring a full isaron. So that we already know. So what do we do with the word oso, which Rabbi Yehuda used to prove that the full isaron has to be brought? The Gemara answers, "L'kohen gadol shemesu minu achetachtov shelo yavi chatzi isar mibeisa." That now, in a case, as we saw in the previous Mishnah, that they replace the Kohen Gadol by the afternoon, and you might think that it's enough that the second Kohen Gadol to replace the first brings a Chatzi son from his possession, the lo Chatzi son shall rishon, or you might think that we should bring the replacement Kohen Gadol should bring the Chatzi son from that which belonged to the departed and deceased Kohen Gadol. Therefore, the Torah has to tell me, and this Rabbi Shimon will derive from the word osah, that we need a whole new full isara, which means that the Kohen Gadol who replaced the first Kohen Gadol is going to have to bring from his bias a full isara. He's divided in 2. Half will be brought on the Mizbeach, and the other half will be nevad, will be destroyed. Frek the Gemara, but what about the old drush that we had back on Daf Nun? Typically, me umachzi sa. And I think that I may have made a mistake yesterday, and I said that the Ika was the mapik hey on the bottom. No, it's the vav at the beginning. That's the extra vav. And the Gemara answers vav lo dosh. Reb Shimon doesn't have a drasha with an extra vav. Now we go back and swing back to Rabbi Yehuda. Remember that Rabbi Shimon derived from chok olam his conclusion. Now Rabbi Yehuda, hai chok olam ma'ovid. What's Rabbi Yehuda going to do? It chuko li olam tehei. In other words, that for all generations, all Kohanim Gedolim have to bring a Minchas Chavitim on a daily basis. Now what do we? Now the Gemara is going to ask a question of Rabbi Yehuda from the pasuk Kolil Taktar, which Rabbi Shimon had used to derive the conclusion that the full isaron has to be brought by the tzibur in event that there was no replacement of the Kohen Gadol who died. Is lamali, what does Rabbi Yehuda do with that? He needs it for another halach in a brisa. Ainli ella el Yona minchas Kohen Gadol bekolil taktir. Right, so we know that the entire minchas chavitim has to be burnt on the mizbeach. Just 1 second. El Yona minchas Kohen Gadol. El Yona, just 1 second. El Yona. El Yona means the pasuk that came before that, which is the minchas chavitim of the Kohen Gadol. That has to be burnt kuli kolil. But tachtona, which is the next pasuk, the subject of which is a regular Kohen, a Kohen Hedjot, that has to bring a minchas chavitim on the first day that he serves in the Mikdash. Below say ochel means it has to be completely burnt on the mizbeach, and this pasuk is telling us that you're not allowed to eat But I'm not exactly sure how we get. To really open up the Chumash here, just to be. But I don't have Pasuk to Zion in front of me. If anyone could open up to Vayikra Perik Vav Pasuk to Zion, but anyway, let's just grant it because we don't have much time. But the Pasuk to Zion addresses what's called a Minchas Nedava of the Kohen Gadol, and the Torah imposes a lav that it should not be eaten. So again, let's just go over this. We have A and we have B, but we're missing C and D. What we know is that the Minchas Chavit in the Kohen Gadol has to be burnt entirely on the Mizbeach. We don't have a lav to derive a lotas if somebody eats part of the Minchas Chavit. So that's A and C. Now we get B. What do we do know? We know that if a Kohen Gadol brings a voluntary mincha, a minchas nedava, there's a separate lav. But we don't know the positive mitzvah of burning the entire minchas nedava, the Kohen Gadol, on the mizbeach, and that's what the Bryce is going to ask now. Minayin litenis omer shel zeh b'zeh v'sa omer shel zeh b'zeh Talmud lomer kolil l'gzeres shav Nemar kan kolil with regard to the minchas chavitim the Kohen Gadol, which is a chova. It says kolil, it has to be completely burnt on the mizbeach, and we didn't know about a voluntary minchas Kohen Gadol. Nemar lahalan kol, but it says kolil in the next pasuk, which again, if you could open up a chumash, it would be helpful. I can't do this all myself. And there also, it says kolil to teach you that the entire voluntary carbon of the Kohen Gadol has to be burnt on the Mizbeach. Now we have to get a lav from the voluntary over to the Minchas Chova. Makan. Now we go in the other direction. Bekolil Toktir. Afkan kol Totir. Umala litain lotas al achilos. Afkan litain lotas al achiloso. That if somebody eats from the Minchas Chavitin of the Kohen Gadol, the Chova, then he violates a lav. Okay. Now, apparently from the Mishnah, we know that if the Kohen Gadol dies, the Chavitim have to be brought. And Rabbi Shimon derives from Chak Olam that the monies have to come from the Tzibur. If it's Sover Rabbi Shimon Shal Tzibur Doraisa, does the Torah actually require that the Tzibur has to pay for the Minchas Chavitim in event that there's no Kohen Gadol? Vatnan, what do we do with the Mishnah? In Shkolim, Omer Rabbi Shimon, Shiva Dvarim Hiskinu Bezdin, which implies that we're talking not about a Doraisa halacha, but about a Darabanan, an institution that was instituted by the Rabbanan V'zeu Echamem. One of them on the list is this one. Sholach imon esachim, kreva mishalovim lav, kreva mishal tzibur. So this is another takana of Bezdin, with regard to a guy who sent his carbon ola from far abroad. And the halacha is that if he did not pay for his own offering, that we have to, I think this is just for the sake of, second. So in other words, again, if he was close by, then we would have to inform him that he's got to pay for the nesachim. But if he's not available, then we have to take it from public funds. But I'm not sure exactly why. Just 1 second. Okay, we have to answer that question. Anyway, now we have a third takana of Bezdin, Ger Shemes, V'niach Zvachim. Like apparently he had designated certain animals for Zvachim, and he died. Is Yeshlo Nesachim Krevim Mishilo? Right? If he had designated Yayin L'Nesachim, then we'll bring it. Fine. That's clear. But what happens in Lav if he did not, he wasn't Makdish the Yayin L'Nesachim, and now who owns it? We're talking about a ger that dies and he has no Yarshim. Is Krev Mishal Tzibur. So it seems like the general rule is that Bezdin made these takanas that in event that we don't have the original person to spend the money and pay the funds for a carbon, then it falls back on the tzibur. Utnai Bezdin hu Kohen Gadol shemeis v'lo minu Kohen acher tachtov. This was the subject of Rav Shimon. The Kohen Gadol died and they had not replaced him. Shetei minchaso kreva mishal tzibur. So now we see from the Mishnah in Shkolim that this whole business that we bring the money of the tzibur as funds to supply the minchas chavitim is all a takon of Bezdin. How could Rav Shimon say that it's a doraisa? Rabbi Avo shtei takonos have doraisa mitzibur. So it's true that in the case of replacement Kohen Gadol, there's no replacement Kohen Gadol. The tzibur has to pay for the minchas chavitim. That's a doraisa. But keva de chazu de kamitcha kolishka, whoa! It seems that they were taking out so much money for the trumas halishka that there wasn't enough money to pay for the minchas chavitim. Is therefore tekinu to ligbe miyoshim. So they made a takana that will collect the monies for the minchas chavitim from the yoshim. Keva de chazu de kapashu bay, meaning that the yoshim did not want to fork over the money for the minchas chavitim, which is understandable because it wasn't really their financial responsibility. O kimna doraisa. Then we went back to the doraisa halacha that the trumas halishka has to pay for the chavitim. Okay, then, so this is where we'll stop for today.